A sixth grade teacher once gave one of those math story problems, that we all love so much growing up. This was the math story problem the sixth grade teacher gave to his class. He said there was a rich woman who died, and she left her $10 million estate to be divided up in the following way. 1/5 was to go to her husband. 1/6 was to go to her son. 1/7 was to go to her butler, and the rest was to be given to charity. Now, what did each get? And as all the math whizzes were scribbling down their equations and figuring it out, there was one girl in the back of the room who quickly raised her hand, and the teacher, startled that someone could figure it out so quick, he said, "Kelly, you know the answer? What did each get?" She said, "A lawyer." Which is probably sad but true. Where there's a will, there often follows a lawsuit. In my 20 years experience as a pastor, I got to tell you, I've probably dealt with more conflicts in families over wills, inheritance, estates, and how to deal with mom and dad's stuff or grandma and grandpa's stuff than over anything else. There's more division in families and among brothers and sisters over dividing up estates than anything that I've experienced. And this was true back in Jesus' day and is still true today, which is to say that what Scripture has to say is relevant. It is relevant to humankind of any day and time, including us today, because it speaks a word of truth about humanity, about God, about life. And it's still true to us today. Well, our scripture today is about this story of this guy coming to Jesus and saying, "Jesus, help us arbitrate or figure out how to deal with this inheritance between me and my brother. We're having this squabble." And then Jesus goes on to tell this parable, this story that, results in our famous saying that we use today, "You can't take it with you," about building bigger barns and God saying, "You fool," right? And all of this takes place in Luke chapter 12. And in Luke chapter 12, it's in this part of Luke's gospel where Jesus is talking about, on the one hand, fear God, and on the other hand, don't worry. Right before this story, Jesus has just said, don't fear the one who can harm you physically. Fear the one who has the power to cast you into hell, namely God. And right before that, Jesus has warned about the yeast of the Pharisees, the hypocrisy of the leaders. Now, hypocrisy in Greek means actor or to act. And he's saying, beware of those who act all godly, but are really very worldly. Who like to walk around in long robes and have the best seat in the market or in the synagogue and be greeted in the marketplaces, etc. Who act all godly, but are actually very worldly. Beware of them, right? He goes on after this to talk about don't worry. Don't worry about what you have today or what tomorrow will bring. Look at the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, and God cares for them. God cares for you even more. Don't worry. And today, in this story, in the midst of all of that, what Jesus is driving at is talking about greed and kind of this egoism and self-obsession, self-absorption, self-consumption, and nihilism. In our story today, the word "I" in this little parable Jesus tells, the word "I" occurs 6 times in just a few short sentences. The word "my" or "me" or "mine" occurs 5 times. Almost a dozen times within a few short sentences, it's all about what I have done and what is mine. No acknowledgement about the neighbor. No social consciousness. No acknowledgement about God. Any kind of gratitude or thanksgiving and acknowledgement about receiving from God and owing God anything. Nothing like that. It's all about me and mine and what I've done to get what is me, what is mine. The problem in the story with this guy is not so much about wealth as it is about his poverty. It's not so much, the problem isn't so much about what he's rich toward as what he's poor toward, that he's poor toward God. The problem in this story isn't so much about money as it is about values. He's built bigger barns, but he has an empty soul. The problem isn't so much about possessions as it is about being possessed. And I think that's what Jesus is driving at in this story. That everyone sitting in this room today, in the same way that everyone he was talking to in that day, every one of you and me is possessed. The question is, by what or by whom will you be possessed? Everyone is possessed by something or someone. And don't begin to kid yourself into thinking that there's some sort of neutral ground where you can choose not to be possessed by something. Everyone is possessed by something or someone. The question is, by who or by what are you going to be possessed? The guy in the story is possessed by his possessions, consumed with consumerism. And again, this is a truth that speaks to humanity and existence of all day and time. I look at my own children and their generation. Many of you sitting in here today. And I am deeply concerned because what I see in my children is them becoming possessed by possessions and consumed with consumerism. In the same way that I know my parents looked at me and my generation, and many of you sitting in here today, and were concerned that I was becoming possessed by possessions and consumed with consumerism. In the same way that Jesus looked at this young man that came to him in that story. So while this is true of all day and time of all of us, I can't help but wonder if it gets worse and worse with every generation. And the thing that is so indicting about that, the thing that is like a dagger to my heart, is that as I look at my children and become worried about them becoming possessed by possessions and consumed with consumerism, is that I realize that I'm to blame. That it's because of my modeling, my mentoring, my parenting, that it's resulting in that. But I also recognize that it's not just me that's influencing their life. I grew up in a day and time where advertising on TV became a big thing. And from black and white to color TVs, yes, I'm that old, when you turned on the TV, you were bombarded every, few minutes with commercials. I turned on the radio and I heard commercials. I drove down the road and I saw billboards that were commercials, trying to convince me that I should not be satisfied with what I had. My children are growing up in a day and an age where they can't get away from it. They can't just turn off the TV or the radio or even driving down the street. It's everywhere. The internet, the TV, the radio, the billboards, anywhere and everywhere they go, it's a bombardment of advertising trying to convince them that they should not be satisfied with their life the way it is. As one TV executive put it, or advertising executive, you ever watched that show, Mad Men? Anybody admit that? Anyway, as one advertising executive put it, it is our job in advertising to convince people that they are not happy with what they have. The newer, nicer, bigger, better will lead to that elusive happiness that they seek. That they should look for happiness in all the wrong places and in all the wrong faces. That's what advertising is all about. It's like this old Roman saying once said about shopping. Actually, it was about money, but they probably shopped back in the old Roman days, didn't they? The money, or shopping, is like drinking seawater. The more you drink, the thirstier you get. This insatiable appetite, this bottomless pit, right? That's what it is, advertising. Convince us that we're not happy with who we are and what we have. Well, though this may get harder and harder and bombarded more and more with every generation, this has been true of all day and all time. The thing is, what Jesus is saying in the story is that we are being fooled. Not just that we're fools, but we are being fooled by all of this. You want to build bigger barns? Why? He says to the guy in the story. Is it just for you, so you might have more? You can only eat so much. You want to build up more barns for more grain? You can't eat that much. Is it thinking, well, I'll have more to provide for my family down the road? You build bigger barns, it's still going to go bad. It's not going to help the future generations necessarily. I look at families who deal with inheritance stuff, and quite often it's over things that aren't even necessarily about value as it is about meaning. That there's some little trinket that mom and dad got on that vacation we took down to the Grand Canyon. Never mind, we were sick of each other by the end of that trip and couldn't wait to get home, but we've had that trinket that mom and dad got from that vacation in the house for the last 50 years, and I want it. And they fight over it to the point that they hate each other. I look at my own life. I've got a 1964 Ford Falcon Sprint convertible. It was my first car I got when I was a junior in high school. My dad bought it from a family that was part of our congregation. It had gone through all of their kids, and now it was in our, and so it had this history, it had this story with it, right? And my dad bought it because, see, he grew up on a farm in the Midwest and he wanted to teach me some mechanics to the city kid, you know. And that gene skipped a generation. It never did come to me. But we bought it so he could teach me some mechanics. And I remember growing up and on weekends and evenings working out in the garage with my dad. I've got this history, this story with this car and this experience with my dad. And I love that car. Now, as I start to have children, and more than one, I'm wondering, well, who's going to get that car? Who's it going to go to? How do I decide this? And I started losing sleep over this until my kids start growing up and getting to an age where they're now starting to drive, and they don't want to drive it. It slips out of third gear. It breaks down after 20 miles. They don't want anything to do with it. Now, maybe the day will come when they do. I don't know. But quite honestly, after I die, I hope they just sell it and divide it up amongst them. Instead of dividing themselves over a car, over something. It's just not worth it. We're being fooled, Jesus says in this story. Not just that we're fools, we're being fooled. You know what the motto of nihilism was back in that day? The motto was, well, part of it Jesus says in the story, eat, drink, and be merry, but that wasn't the whole motto. You get some of it in Ecclesiastes, but Paul quotes the whole thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 when he's talking about resurrection. The motto was, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. Eat, drink, and be merry. Grab all you can of life today. Hold on tight. Get as much as for the self as you can. Don't worry about the environment and future generations. Who cares? Eat, drink, and tomorrow, because tomorrow may never come. But what if there is a tomorrow? As Paul writes about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Don't be fooled by the motto. What if there is a tomorrow that makes today pale in comparison? What if there is a tomorrow that will be filled with so much more joy than you can imagine today? What if there is a tomorrow where you will wear a crown of righteousness and a crown of glory that makes every hat that you wear in this life pale in comparison? What if there is a tomorrow and a day after that and a forever? Does that change what you do and how you live with today? What if there is a tomorrow that frees you from that nihilism, that frees you from holding on tight and worrying only about the self? That's what happens for the disciples at the end of the story after Jesus is raised from the dead. When the resurrection takes place, they are freed. And they began to look at life and what they have and who they are in a whole new way. They begin to say things like, "The Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can anyone do to me?" And they make him say things like, "I know what awaits for me, a crown of righteousness, so I can endure whatever persecutions may come my way in this life." They begin to say things like, "For freedom, Christ has set you free. Don't submit again to a yoke of slavery. Don't be fooled. For eat, drink, and be merry, enjoy life and what God has provided. But there is a tomorrow. There is a tomorrow."